This is a fan-generated show. If you would like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com and also don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Good evening. Welcome to the Glazov Gang. Tonight, our very special program, Fidel Castro, The Death of a Monster, backed by popular demand. Humberto Fontova, the author of 4 books, including his latest, The Longest Romance, the Mainstream Media and Fidel Castro. Humberto, what an honor to have you back on the show.
Thanks a lot, buddy. Thanks a lot for the invite. Anytime. You all know that.
Humberto, Fidel Castro died recently, and I've heard that you've been partying nonstop ever since.
Believe it or not, I got the news. I heard the news today. Oh boy, I heard the news when I was 25 feet in a pine tree deer hunting Sunday morning, which is not the best time. And I ended up doing 3 radio interviews from a tree 25 feet. So it wasn't the best time to get this. And, it was very similar to the last time Cuba was big in the news, December 17th of 2014. If you remember, that was when Obama opened up essentially relations with Cuba. December 17th. I was also up in a tree. So
Humberto, before we get to the issue, what is this thing? On Facebook, I have to say, I'm always seeing pictures of you with fish and deer and you're in trees. What's going on?
Because this happens, this is the height of the hunting and fishing season in Bayou country where I live, Jamie. You see, this is Thanksgiving, Christmas. This is when all the Bayou boys, all the Cajun Cubans were hunting and fishing. So we don't usually have a lot of time for this kind of stuff unless it's for my friend Jamie.
I see. All right. Well, I kind of have a love of animals. I don't want to get into a big debate here, but you don't kill innocent animals, right?
No, I kill stuff from my refrigerator, from my freezer, and from my family feast. Tonight, our family had a big feast with the harvests of my hunt. My trophies show up on my dinner table. Put it to you that way.
All right, I'm not sure what innocent animal means, but what are some of the animals that you hunt primarily?
Ducks and deer primarily.
And you eat
very,
both?
Very good. No preservatives, no hormone treatments, fresh, genuinely organic, wild roaming meat. That's what we eat in the Fontova household, buddy.
All right. We'll get back to that. It's an important topic. But let us begin. Humberto, what was your first reaction when you heard about the death of this monster?
Believe it or not, it was ho-hum. And though that might strike some people as strange, is because I realized that nothing is going to really, it's anticlimactic. If it had happened 10 or 15 years ago, woo, then something would have changed. But the fact is, Raul Castro has been running Cuba officially for the last 10 years and unofficially for the last 20 years. You see, Raul Castro, the military, more or less took over the Cuban economy when the Soviet Union fell. So it's been a long time, and they're running, and they have got a very good gravy train. They've got a very sweet deal right now because they own the tourist infrastructure, the whole industry, lock, stock, and barrel. The Cuban military does. Lots of these guys are in their 70s and 80s. So they're not going to give it up. They're not going to give it up.
No, I understand. It doesn't change very much, but still a very evil man has died. Now, you were on MSNBC the other day with Soledad O'Brien, and she was saying that, this is all very complicated, Humberto. I mean, there's Cubans that also like Castro, so this isn't black and white. I mean, there's people that liked Hitler and Stalin too. Let's not be too judgmental with only one picture of this.
Well, you better than anyone probably know that there were many Russians who grieved for Stalin, and still grieve for Stalin. These things happen. How on earth does that whitewash all the crimes. As I explained to them on television, I said, we're not talking about the little tin pot dictator that you see, in a Hollywood movie for Latin America. We're talking about a genuine Stalinist who jailed and tortured political prisoners at a higher rate than Stalin. Higher rate, obviously not higher in absolute numbers.
Yeah. Well, you really schooled her on MSNBC. It was so bizarre that she even brought that stuff up, and it's obvious that she's got some kind of Stockholm syndrome with leftists as well, trying to be in their good graces of how open-minded she is. Now, some of the things that you just mentioned, you've also documented this in your works. Let me just go over this for a minute. Castro jailed and tortured political prisoners at a higher rate than Stalin's regime during the Great Terror. He murdered, mostly by firing squad, more political prisoners in the first 3 years in power than Hitler's regime murdered in his first 6. And Castro drove 20 times as many people to die trying to escape Cuba as died trying to escape East Germany. Humberto, thank you so much for bringing up these facts, because we never hear about this in our media. Why don't you expand a little bit for us on this horror?
Yeah, and I am going to make an exclusive admission here from my friend Jamie. Do y'all know that I was in a remote studio during that show with MSNBC, and I did not know that I was addressing Soledad O'Brien. Okay. I did not know who it was, because the studio I was in, I couldn't see the screen because it had just changed it. The screen was on the side. So I'm hearing all of this Valley Girl idiotic drivel about Cuba. And I thought it was Christina Aguilera, Lady Gaga, some serious dingbat I'm hearing. And I'm just shooting back at it. Wait a minute, I can't believe I'm shooting back at it the whole time. I get finished. That was in New Orleans studio. I drive home. An hour and a half later, I get home. And I go on the computer and I see a headline: Cuban American shellacks, eviscerates, destroys Soledad O'Brien. And I said, cool, I wonder who that was. Let me check who that was. And I read the story. Oh, it was me. I did not know at the time who it was. But I'm glad I didn't know, because I may have been more respectful if I had known it was a big media figure. But the things coming out of our mouth were so absolutely idiotic that I said, my goodness, what are you going to do?
Humberto, very idiotic. And also there are some other words we can use for something else that she said. During that interview, she was bringing up Afro-Cubans in such a way as to imply that somehow Afro-Cubans are doing very well or better under Castro's Cuba. Cuba became more Afro-Cuban under Castro, and she was, whatever she was saying there, she was saying how the rich, educated Cubans left, and then the Afro-Cubans somehow fared better. Humberto, in terms of everything that you've documented, tell our audience about why there's a Rosa Parks civil rights movement in Cuba. I mean, the vicious, sadistic persecution of black people in Cuba. It's incredible that she said this.
The vast majority of the Cuban dissidents today, Berta Soler, Oscar Bisset, Antunes, the list goes on and on, are mostly black. The ladies in white, there's a name of Cuba's most prominent dissident movement. They are called the ladies in white. They dress in white. They started as the wives of political prisoners, of male political prisoners. Most of the ladies in white actually have black skin. Most of Cuba's dissidents have black skins. How many of our viewers realize that a few months ago, most of these black Cuban dissidents were protesting Obama's opening to Cuba by wearing Obama masks? Naturally, they were rounded up, but I wrote about it for Front Page magazine. This is the kind of thing that's been going on. The names of Cuban dissidents movements Rosa Parks movement, and they will always stress when they're interviewed, the few times they're interviewed by the international media, that their role models are Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Mahatma Gandhi, those kind of people.
Humberto, I apologize for my pronunciation, but the Castro regime murdered black human rights activist Orlando Zapata Tamayo, a black political prisoner that was on a hunger strike a few years back, correct?
He smuggled out some samiztats that you have to call shortly before his death. And he said that his guards, all lily white, members of the Castro regime, would denounce him as, "You filthy N-word, you filthy N-word," as they were beating him during his hunger strike.
Now, Humberto. Now, Tamayo's experience, the horrifying suffering, the persecution, his death, represents the fate of black Cubans. Why would Soledad O'Brien, who comes from a Cuban background, and she's Cuban American, why would she say what she said about how implying that Afro-Cubans somehow are faring well in Castro's Cuba?
I'm going to be kind here and guess she doesn't keep up with Cuban news. I'm going to be kind here for that, because there's no way that a rational person who actually follows the issue, Jamie, that's the issue. Most people don't follow. We don't have that many outlets to get this information out. That's great that we have you guys. We don't have that many. So I'm going to be kind and say that Soledad did not really know what's going on in Cuba.
I really like compliments to the Glazov gang, and it sounded like CNN. You couldn't even see the screen well. Do you think the Glazov gang technology is better than CNN's?
No, but it lets us get the truth out. In CNN, I get 3 seconds, to tell Cuban history. 3 seconds every 2 or 3 years. On a Glazov gang, I get 15, 20 minutes to tell the actual story. Every time I do one of these things on national TV, I get a million phone calls, a million emails. Humberto, why didn't you tell me? Humberto, folks, I've got 20 seconds. I can't tell everything. I've got to hit what's most newsworthy.
Okay, Humberto, what's on your mind right now in terms of Castro's death? What are you thinking about?
Here's what's going to happen, Jamie. I really think changes will probably come to Cuba, not as a result of Fidel Castro's death, but as a result of the recent U.S. presidential elections. President-elect Trump, during his campaign speech, one of his final ones, he visited Miami, and he got, we wrote about this on the front page, the endorsement of the Bay of Pigs Association. He was like 60%. And he pledged to reverse Obama's executive orders, because all of this opening to Cuba, the 4 to 5 billion folks that are flowing from the U.S. to Cuba annually and have been about for the last 5 or 6 years, that's more than the Soviets used to send there, by the way, folks. This is a result of travel expenses from travelers going to Cuba, U.S. travelers, and remittances, wires of money. And that resulted from Obama's executive orders. So the next president, and I wrote a column about this for Front Page, and I said, with a stroke of his pen, the next president could reverse Obama's concessions to the Castro regime. Don't you know that exactly a week after that article was published, Trump made a campaign stop in Cuba, in Miami, and he used those exact words right down to a few strokes of my pen. And so you're saying, some of our viewers are saying, well, it's campaign stump, Humberto. All politicians, especially when they go to South Florida, make promises to Cuban Americans. But Mr. Trump has made some appointments to his transition team. Most importantly, a fellow named Mauricio Claver Coroni. Most of the people have not, but he headed the Cuban American Democracy Pact, Cuban American equivalent of APAC. In other words, he was extremely knowledgeable. His job was to keep the votes going for maintaining the embargo. Nobody understands the Cuban embargo, the details, the laws, the dotting the I's better than that gentleman. Nobody knows how badly the letter of U.S. law has been violated by Obama's executive orders. No one is better placed that if somebody's serious about reversing it, he's the man to go to. And don't you know that Trump appointed him to this transition team? When I saw that, I went, whoa, he meant it.
Humberto, have you been drinking a lot of coffee before this show?
Of course, that's what's in that cup.
All right. I'm just checking. Now, Humberto, you have a lot of energy, but I like it. Humberto Fontova, were you sobbing the night that Hillary lost?
By no means, but by no means. No, as I mentioned, Cuban Americans voted for Trump at a higher rate than did, I'm using quotation marks, white Americans, because supposedly rural whites, they voted for Trump at about the same rate as Southern whites. Some people will say, well, that's because Cuban Americans are themselves Southern whites. They're white and they live in the Southern United States. But the fact is, I have a lot of Afro-Cuban friends, and I know many of them, and they all went whole hog for Donald Trump.
Okay, Humberto, tell us a bit. Let's rewind here about you a bit, why you're so passionate about this. What is your background? What brings you to this story and to this narrative?
Well, first of all, I was born in Cuba. I lived there till I was 7 years old. My father was a political prisoner in Cuba. In fact, my father is 90 years old. He is exactly Fidel Castro's age. He was Fidel Castro's college classmate at the University of Havana. And already in the late 40s, everyone who had any contact with Castro knew him to be a gangster, a criminal. He murdered 2 fellow students, obviously, naturally shooting them in the back during his university years. My father knew that, and a lot of Cuban contemporaries of him knew that. That is why they were so appalled when they saw the State Department and the CIA backing Castro against Batista. But that's part of my background. My other background is that I have a master's degree in Latin American studies, where my specialty was the Cuban Revolution. And I've written 3 books about it. But the sources for my books, Jamie, this is the most important part, are primary sources. They're living witnesses to the Cuban Revolution who are overlooked by every other so-called historian. You follow the footnotes in my books. And believe me, I had many conference calls with the legal departments of literally the biggest publishers in the world who publish my books, and every one of my footnotes stood.
Fantastic. Humberto, sorry to ask, so your dad is still living?
Yeah. Oh, as a matter of fact, my father, 90 years old, the weekend that Fidel Castro died, he was hunting along with me. Me and my dad were deer hunting the morning the news came down. Same age as Fidel Castro. And that's how robust he is, that he can still go hunting and fishing with his children and grandchildren.
Okay, I just want to take a break here from the political theme. What's your dad's secret in terms of staying so healthy till his age?
Family, surrounded by family. Most of us live here in South Louisiana and Florida. His children, his grandchildren. My mother passed away 2 years ago, and that was a tough blow.
Yes,
but his hobbies, let's face it, he has much more wholesome hobbies. I know you're not fond of shooting animals, but he shoots ducks and he shoots deer. He doesn't shoot political dissidents, like his classmate in Havana.
So we would say that the love of family adds to a longer life.
The family surrounded, he was constantly surrounded by his children. Every night he's visited, or he visits, or he has dinner. We just had dinner this evening, 10 of us, the family. That's very important, I think. I'm not a doctor, but it seems like it to me.
I would agree 100% that love keeps us going, family keeps us going. Now, Humberto, how did you guys get out of Cuba?
Well, that was an interesting story. We were at the airport, And my mom had somehow gotten all the paperwork together. This is October of 1961. And we're at the airport, me, my mother, my dad, my brother, who was 5 at the time, my sister, who was 8, and I was 7. And we're getting ready to board the plane, a Constellation, a prop plane at the time. And just as we're getting aboard the plane, the guards come out and they grab my dad by both shoulders and start dragging him off. And my mom, you can imagine, what's going on? What's going on? Says, you're not going anywhere. You're not going. And so my mom says, and at that time, October of 61, Jamie, hundreds of men and boys were being murdered by firing squad weekly. So we see him being dragged off. My mom goes, okay, if you can't come with us, then I'm not leaving either. I can't leave without you for the U.S., without a penny to my name, because people have to remember all Cubans left Cuba with the clothes on their back. That was it. You know how communists are. They steal everything you have. So just as they're getting ready to drag him through the doors, he turns around and he says, you are leaving. I demand that you leave because I do not want my children growing up in a communist country. So my mom somehow sucked it up. You know, we're clutching our hands. We get on the plane. And I just remember a plane full of weeping people. Mostly it was women and children on board because they were doing this a lot to a lot of the other male Cubans who were trying to leave. We get to Miami, where we had already had some relatives. My mom rushes to my aunt's house. She picks up the phone and calls Cuba. What happened to Humberto? And I remember at 7 years, she heard something. She went, I know. She fainted. She dropped the phone and fainted. My aunt came rushing over. One aunt is tending to my mom. The other aunt grabs the phone. What happened? She screams. I know. What they hear is that my father is at G2 headquarters in La Cabaña. In other words, torture, firing squad central. So I'm guessing my mom figures, okay, I'm in a strange country for her, without a penny to my name, 3 kids to somehow raise, and now apparently I am also a widow. And I guess it was too much for her. But we sucked it up. We came to New Orleans, where we had also relatives and friends. And folks, when you leave a country with the clothes on your back, you want to go someplace where you have some really close relatives or good friends. And that's what we had in New Orleans. A few months go by. Another phone call comes through. My mom picks up the phone. She screams again. But this was a scream of joy, amigos. It was my father calling from New Orleans International Airport saying, can someone please come pick me up? Somehow or another, we scrounged up a vehicle from a friend or something, and we drove to the airport. And this was a time when the planes would park out and they would put the ladder up and people would walk through. And I will never forget the sight of my dad walking down and my mom running across the tarmac and my dad running across in that hug.
Wow, what a beautiful story.
Jamie, ours had a happy ending. I want to remind our viewers that tens of thousands of Cuban families did not have a happy ending, as you know from the figures that I cited at the beginning of the show. Ours had a very happy ending. We're grateful. And but let's please remember, you can sit on any street corner in Miami and hear much worse stories.
I can believe it. Humberto, thank you so much for sharing that story with us. And I think we've got maybe a movie on your family that could be made. We are at a time. Could you, under a minute, for our audience, tell them about the books that you wrote that they should get immediately? Under a minute, please.
Right. The last one is called The Longest Romance, the mainstream media and Fidel Castro, and it documents how the mainstream media, starting in 57, the best quote is Che Guevara's, was the source of my second book. Che Guevara said, more important than guerrilla recruits for our guerrilla army were American media recruits to spread our propaganda. And folks, as we just saw over the last couple of days, they're still doing it as enthusiastically as they did it in 1957, 58, and 59. Well, you could kind of excuse them because people didn't really know who Fidel was, except for people like my dad. But to be doing that after 50 years, folks, but everything on my website, Fontova.com. If you put either Humberto or Fontova in Google, my website's the first thing that comes up. I'm proud to say.
Thank you very much, Humberto Fontova. Thanks for joining the Glazov Gang. And thank you from our hearts at the Glazov Gang for everything you've done for freedom. And also on this occasion and on this issue for continuing the battle for the freedom of the Cuban people and for telling the truth about their oppression.
Anytime, amigo. Thanks for getting the opportunity. As I said, we don't have many sources. You're one of them.
Thank you, Humberto. And Glazov Gang audience, get The Longest Romance, The Mainstream Media and Fidel Castro by Humberto Fontova. Please remember, we are a fan-generated program. Go to jamieglazov.com to support this show and make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube channel of the Glazov Gang. We'll see you really soon. Good night.